And in their pottery, it was useful, utilitarian, and based on nature motifs again, either animals, flowers, shells, very enjoyable looking, in sort of a free-flowing, asymmetrical pattern design. Slide. In the architecture, you had the beehive tombs, and you also had the palace at Minos, which had a very definite tapered column with like a pillow or mushroom cap to it. Slide. In the archaic Greek, we have, first of all, the pottery. Pottery stopped, the decoration of pottery stopped around 350 AD. These were used for funerary purposes, not utilitarian purposes. They fed oils down into the ground to the body buried below. The archaic Greek pottery was very formal. It was equally balanced. All the patterns circled around. The very first was just pure geometric design, such as you see at the very top of this vase. And then there were sort of silhouetted figures, and then it became a little more free-flowing and a more naturalistic pose of decorating, but basically in earth colors, the black iron ore, the red iron ore, and then they had a white sort of chalky surface sometimes that they would use. Slide. In the figures, you have definitely a very freestanding but straightforward male and female figure, highly stylized, with the archaic face, the smile, the bulging eyes, but a very stiff figure with weight on both legs, evenly spaced on both legs. Slide. In the architecture, you had the development of the Greek architecture, the three column orders, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. They were usually based on some sort of mathematical key. The idea of perfectionism absolutely controlled the Greek architect. Slide. Then in the classical Greek, you have the figure in repose or in relaxing, and then the later Hellenistic period of the classic period, you have the figure in action. Slide. In the Etruscan, or you might say the early Roman, but the Etruscans lived in the northern part of Italy, the two main art forms that they developed were the coffin covers, where they had their portraits in terracotta placed on top of the coffin, sort of in a reclining figure. And, slide please, they had their tombs, underground tombs, decorated in paintings of some sort of interest that the person had. Very decorative, very lyrical. There's no harsh angles in Etruscan work. They seemed like a very happy people. Slide. Then the Romans developed the arch principle, which allowed them to span greater spaces and have a much more unique style of architecture. The Greeks never used the arch. The Romans also used much more decoration. They also used brick in building and then covered it with pilasters, such as these columns against the side of the building. They were decoration and not support. Slide. In their artwork, they also introduced portraiture for the first time, and their own belongings, and in their homes they did walls that had garden scenes or architectural scenes that sort of enlarged visually the space of the small interior room. Slide, please. In early Christian art, you have two forms again. The catacombs, the paintings on the wall depicting how man could overcome through faith, could overcome great obstacles. And they also had, slide please, their coffin covers. And then in the Byzantine art, you have, let me
have your attention, please. This tape is on medieval art. Put in the first slide, please. After 1,000 years of Christianity, Christians around the year 1000 found it sort of hard put to follow their beliefs. Italy was a divided country, a bunch of little principalities that were constantly at war with each other. France and the more northern or colder countries were still a feudal state, emerging from the Dark Ages. The people of the Middle Ages, it's a term that was devised in a much later time, probably did not know that they were in the middle. This sort of gives the feeling that from ancient greatness, they were in the middle period to modern greatness. They felt that they were at the point of highest achievement. But looking at medieval art, I think it is best, through the art itself, to see how the people lived, how they survived, how things progressed. The year 1000 is approximately the turning point. From that period on, there was a great population explosion, development of cities, buildings of large castles and cathedrals. And within this type area, the architecture, especially of the late medieval period, is called Gothic. Whereas most of the art, or the way of life, the manners, the dress, well up into the 14th century and even in some spots into the 17th century, is considered medieval. Slide, please. The gathering of different clans, the formations of cities, mostly moated, protected by walls, form a fascinating pattern to the daily life of these medieval people. We're going to be looking, interspersed with manuscript drawings, pages of illustrations, art objects, utility instruments. In the city of Nuremberg in Germany, a southern Bavarian city, it was founded along the Pegnitz River approximately in the year 1000. It is completely and still within the old city itself today, a marvelous example of medieval architecture and how a city is laid out. We will intersperse contemporary photographs of Nuremberg along with the drawings and art of the other medieval period to sort of correlate the two. Slide, please. One of the great things that happened around the year 10,000 with this explosion of sort of urbanization were the Crusades and the rise of rulers. This one, a council showing Edward I of England with the church people on the right-hand side in their red outfits and the noblemen placed over on the left-hand side with the ruler there in the center. Medieval art is sort of a delightful, naive presentation, quite primitive, except it was a statement of the times. They were portraying what was interesting to them. Slide, please. We all have sort of romantic ideas when we see a castle or a knight. We have our favorites, Sir Lancelot. The depiction of St. George killing the dragon has been a favorite subject in art all through the ages. Tapestries, which were used to sort of warm the very cold halls of the medieval castles, were colorful things. Not only the warmth that was achieved by blocking out the drafty window or opening areas, but a very rich and colorful decoration. Slide, please. The Duc de Berry had his prayer book beautifully illustrated that he carried along with him, and many of the things were little normal everyday scenes, such as this, the Duke going out on a journey. But within it, and we will see some other examples from the Book of the Hours, it was called, which were just prayers, the religious things that they carried along with them in their very sort of pious attitude. The medieval period is one of contrast, of a very pagan attitude because of the physical properties that they had to live with, and this devoted spirit to religion, the sort of overzealous effect of trying to free the Holy Land from the Muslim rule. Slide, please. Pope Urban I called a council, and from it sprang the first crusade. Although the spiritual fervor that was brought from this meeting led many other pilgrims to the Holy Land, this one was the first major one formed by the church or by the hierarchy to free the religious areas from barbarians or pagan rule. Slide, please. These pilgrims set out on foot to the Holy Land, and some of them, in this one, a 13th century illustration, shows some barbarians as they pull up on the straggling end of the marchers and looting within the group. These were unorganized processions. They had thought of no provisions or places to sleep, so they sort of fell apart. There was great pillaging in villages as they came, needing food for the whole massive group. And as a result, the pilgrim fell apart long before it ever reached the Holy Land. Slide, please. These are two manuscript illustrations demonstrating, in this one, the fall of Antioch. Slide, please. And in this one, showing the great epidemic that hit the Crusades, the illnesses that befell the group, many of the leaders leaving, stranding the made crusaders or the pilgrims to their own devices. Slide, please. Also, the Christians were not very sympathetic conquerors. King Richard at one point had 2,400 Muslims beheaded after he conquered one of the cities. And this is a 15th century illustration showing the siege of one of the eastern cities. Slide, please. The armor is a beautiful design. It was utilitarian, used for a purpose, but the artwork that went into it, the craftsmanship, makes it a thing of beauty today, even though it was a very utilitarian object in the day it was worn. Slide, please. Another part of the scene showing the embattlements. Slide, please. The same armor that was used in battle then carried over later on in periods of peace into the jousts, which were mock battles. Slide, please. Many of the crusaders did not go by land, feeling it was too long and circuitous a route, and many of them left by sea. This 13th century illustration shows the loading of stores from Naples of a group of crusaders leaving for the Holy Land. Slide, please. Slide, please. The fighting was quite ferocious, except as in one of the main key words of the medieval period was courtesy. And this was sort of an overall meaning, not only the courtesy of a knight in battle, but a courtesy of a man to a lady, or a courtesy between men. And there was one chronicle that read, when one fighter had severed another man's head, he laid his sword straight length over his body, and then took his own sword and laid it to form the cross over the vanquished man's body. And he was said, how gentlemanly a thing to do. Slide, please. Another tapestry of a battle, a very rich pattern design, almost abstract in quality, until you can find the intricacies of all the things that are going on within the general composition. Slide, please. The feeling of the nights carried through the romantic journey to the east to save the Holy Lands from the pagans, the riding into battle with a gift from the Lady Fair, all of this was sort of done on a courtly style. This was a knight riding into armor, into battle. Slide, please. But the cities themselves were sort of complex things. Of course, this is a much later modern view of the city, although the church that you see, the spires rising, is a 13th century Gothic structure of the Lorenzkirche, or St. Lorenz in Nuremberg. Slide, please. As these communes were gathered together with the feudal lord, he performed the protective services that the people needed from the barbarians. They moved into the city to protect themselves and then moved out to their farming lands during the day. And this is an illustration that shows the men coming in to pay their allegiance to the nobleman, and in return they will pay him his due amount for this protection. Slide, please. Within the city, a medieval city, it was usually moated, as Nuremberg is today, in a castle wall that surrounds the entire city. There were 4 major gates to Nuremberg, each guarded by one of these tall towers that was used as a fortification. The whole city itself is on a gentle slope, sort of a lopsided ring that leads up to the castle on the opposite side of the city. Slide, please. There was, within the city areas, this is an illustration of the leaders of the city of Parma in Italy, and they're on a procession carrying candles. But there was great class structure, the dignity of the ruling class, the elite, the wealthy, and then it slowly went down into the working class. Slide, please. Also, with the development of cities, you have great centers of learning, and this is an early medieval illustration of a university lecture class. Slide, please. But the life in the castle, and this is the castle in Nuremberg, a few views of it, was an intriguing thing when you find out all the little intricacies of the daily activities within the castle walls. Slide, please. The castle itself, with the noble class, was almost communal living in very close quarters. Slide, please. And it was mainly this gathering for protection of the noble class. Slide, please. Within the castle walls, it was almost like an entirely different world. Their own separate little garden areas, their own private apartments, the great hall where everybody would gather for food. Slide, please. And delightful gardens where people could stroll and carry on their daily activities. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. All of this sounds very delightful. Beautiful springtime, lovers in the garden, beautiful flowers, ambling along little paths. Except this was not only the case. The medieval life was a fairly difficult life to lead. The center of the noble's life was the castle hall. Here he held court, transacted affairs, entertained, and dined on the trestle tables set up for each meal. When he had private business, he took his visitors to his bedchambers. In the winter, the castle was very cold. In the early period, a fire was built in the center of the hall. The smoke found its way through a small opening in the roof. The arrangement had the advantage that little heat was lost, and smoke was thought to be beneficial. It cured some diseases and hardened the house timbers also. Wall fireplaces and chimneys were uncommon before the 14th century. The high guest and the nobleman centered themselves close to the fireplace and were kept fairly warm. The lesser important people huddled in the far corners and in the winters nearly froze to death. Glass was not common until the 14th century and was a very precious item, so precious in fact that the nobleman would usually have the glass removed, wrapped, and stored whenever he left the castle. Bedrooms rarely had a fireplace. The main heat of the castle was in the dining hall area, and it was here, in front of his guests, that the nobleman, usually ensconced close to the fire, would undress for bed down to his underwear, which was again not used until about the 14th century, and warm himself before retiring to the very cold bedroom. On extremely cold nights, a fire was usually set in the middle of the bedroom, or hot coals in a brazier brought from the dining area. Slide, please. People just simply endured the cold. The banqueting had sort of a very forced tradition that they followed. The castle's day began at dawn. Since there were no clocks, they heard the Angelus bells ringing in the town church, but no one ever knew what time it was. Just they had their big meal in the morning, because later in the evening, if it got too dark, everybody retired. They lived strictly by daylight. Candles were much too expensive, only used in churches. So it was really refreshing when they finally entered the spring or the summer period where their days were extended. The feast, a few noblemen would bring their own tools or implements. Forks were one of the last of the utensils to be developed. They would usually have some sort of a wash basin or bowl that would be passed around among the guests. And then a long towel also passed, starting from the nobleman on down, as it got wetter and blacker from the grime washing the hands before the meal. Usually the food was served in a bowl that was shared between two people. And since there were very few implements, possibly a spoon being presented, the meal was eaten with the fingers. For disease, to combat disease, the meats and things were usually cooked way past any tasteful stage, boiled, and overboiled, or it would have gone bad. Please. They did have all sorts of entertainments, usually in the early evening period, following the light evening meal. And this was one depiction of a certain event where the dancers, dressed up as birds and feathers, got too close to the fire and they perished, having burned to death. Slide, please. Slide, please. The many different activities are depicted delightfully in many of the early little illustrations. They weren't paintings as such, because the paintings would not have lasted. Some were little miniature things that they could carry with them, or the series of tapestries, but most of these things are illustrations that were kept in books. The boys are playing out in the yard while the artist is painting the portrait of the lady of the manor. Slide, please. On the way to the Queen's bedchamber, slide, please. We see a very elaborate interior where interior decoration has reached an ultimate. Rich brocades, velvets, embroideries. Clothing was very important, the style. Many times to have warmth, many layers of clothing were piled on top of each other. And then slits or tears put in upper layers of clothing so that you could see the rich materials that were hidden beneath. The length of the dresses, the length of the tunics on the men were very important and constantly changed in style, so fad is nothing new to modern times. At one point, the men's breeches or tights became so tight that it was very difficult for them to even sit down. Slide, please. A tracery pattern of a Gothic window in the castle. Slide, please. In depiction of their favorites, as you would collect movie stars' photographs today, but Sir Lancelot. Slide, please. And again from the Duc de Berry's Book of Hours, St. George killing the dragon. He was the ultimate of chivalry. Slide, please. As I mentioned before, the jousts, which were really sort of courtesy battles, which kept the men in tune, in shape, were done before a delighted audience as entertainment. Troubadours were another favored form of entertainment as they sang wild stories of faraway places or of heroic battles or some great feat that was performed. Slide, please. Slide, please. Another form of the sports or entertainments was falconry. Slide, please. And this is an early illustration of King John of England, who was supposedly a great hunter, not a very good ruler, chasing a stag. Slide, please. The next few illustrations are preparations for a hunt. They're a beautiful, intricate overall pattern. These are the men getting the dogs ready to be loosed for the hunt. Notice how it's almost a very rich material applique cutout where the background forms a very fanciful pattern. The trees are sort of closely cropped, and within that area, again, a very fancy pattern. Many times they use the dark background, such as behind in the middle area, so that these little bits of flowers and of leaves would stand out, be distinct. Slide, please. The men are preparing the traps, weaving them. Slide, please. And here are the hunters approaching the stag. Size, of course, had absolutely no bearing whatsoever. It was an overall flat pattern of where all of these objects were sort of pasted against one another, but a very intricate pattern. Look at the beautiful work. Instead of a sky, just a beautiful, rich pattern. Slide, please. Bears in the wood. Slide, please. And then after the fight was over, a large banquet scene out in the open that was set up for the hunters. Slide, please. But work did have to go on. Not everybody was of the noble class. And especially within the cities, with a rising sort of bourgeois society of shopkeepers and fairly wealthy middle class, but not of the nobility. And then you have this tapestry of the woodsman cutting wood. Slide, please. And the men out in the field, the farmers. Slide, please. Back again in Nuremberg, one of the major areas before you get to the castle is called Platz, or Dürer's Place, and it's where Albert Dürer, a 15th century German artist, lived. Many shops, goldsmith shops around here, craftsmen of all description, lived within the city. There, with the Frauenkirche that we'll see later on, they had an annual weekday market where everybody brought their wares to sell. Slide, please. And this is shopkeepers in their stalls selling their goods. Slide, please. An apothecary shop, or the forerunner to the drugstore. Slide, please. Again, out among the street of the shops. Slide, please. These half-timbered buildings are really medieval. They work up the structure with the wood itself, sometimes using bent trunks of the tree to form certain designs. And then the outside and the inside wall are the same, where they plaster with a mixture of sort of a plaster cement sort of thing with rocks and twigs and gravel and everything, and fill in between each of these areas. Slide, please. And this is the chemist's laboratory. Slide, please. Most of the shops were out in the open, sort of set up in a marketplace. Slide, please. Slide, please. Of course, there were amusements for the nobility, this courtly way that they went about. And of course, for the middle-class society, they also had their forms of amusement too. These are the wine drinkers. Slide, please. And an argument over a chess game. Slide, please. And also the height of luxury were the communal baths at the local restaurants. These, of course, were frowned upon as immoral. Slide, please. But people do remain people. Many activities are just normal human activities, such as a snowball fight. Slide, please. Even with the more secular aspect of the medieval society, as we have seen it, they were also very religious, and they built these marvelous cathedrals in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And this is called Gothic, or Gothic style of architecture. Gothic architecture was constructed in the medieval period. Most of the artworks would be considered medieval, especially the manuscripts, and then the style of architecture would be considered Gothic. We'll go into that into more detail next in the next lecture. This is the Lorenzkirche, or the St. Lawrence's Church in Nuremberg, and it's a beautiful 13th century building. It is of natural stone and very ornamented steeple tops in an oxidized copper. Slide, please. The interior of the church is a beautiful example of the verticality or the spiraling effect in the intricacies of archways that dominated the Gothic style. Where Romanesque had been a fairly heavy, somber, solid type structure, the Gothic architecture soared off to new heights, spanning distances that were unheard of before. Instead of going to the round arch, they go to a pointed arch that would give it even a higher feeling visually. And also by buttressing the 2 points together,
they could extend it to a greater height. Sometimes in buildings, they just went a little too far, the whole structure collapsed, and then they started over again. But great, massive feats of engineering in the Gothic cathedrals. In the spring, as in most of the southern German cities, they cut the young birch trees with the white trunks and the very thin, pale green leaves, and they tie them around all the columns within the church, so that as you enter, it's sort of a very pale, leafy green arbor. Slide, please. Returning to the Duc de Berry's Book of the Hours, which is one of the most elegant and beautiful of the illustrated manuscripts, we have the story of the birth of Christ from the Annunciation, and you must realize that these are fairly small things. The illustrations would be about 5, 6, 7 inches. These were done on parchment or of hides, and then trimmed in gold, written, and then sort of a thin wash of color put on top of the parchment. Slide, please. Adoration of the shepherds. Slide, please. Slide, please. Adoration of the Magi. Slide, please. Flight into Egypt. Slide, please. Outside the St. Lawrence's Church is a fountain, many of which decorate the different little areas of Nuremberg. Slide, please. In one of the most beautiful, but a little Gothic church that was all destroyed with the exception of the facade during the Second World War is the Frauenkirche, and it faces on the large open square that is the marketplace each week. Slide, please. It has a marvelous mechanical clock that chimes and the figures move at noon each day. And then on the opposite side is the Schönebrunnen, or the beautiful fountain. It has a very elaborate grilled ironwork fencing around it. It was originally built on the ground as the steeple for this church, but they never could get it up, and they just left it as a fountain. Slide. Slide, please. It's decorated with the whole series of these little water spots on 4 different sides that sort of fill balancing wooden troughs that then you can use it as a water source. You just pull the spout down, which comes through the iron grate, fill your bucket or whatever you have, and then lift it back up and it flows back into the pool. Most of the figures are of medieval period saints, religious figures. Slide, please. They're polychromed, they're limestone carving, colored, and then overlaid with gold leaf. Slide, please. It would be a shame to miss the intricacies of all of these figures had they been placed on top of the church. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Clear the machine.